Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started. So welcome to our Negotiating for Results session. I'm Deborah Kaufman with Stop Waste, which is the Alameda County Waste Management and Recycling Organization. And I'm happy to introduce our speakers today. We're lucky enough to have the panel from HF&H talking about negotiating for results. And I'll introduce each speaker as they get up. Our first speaker is Peter Deibler, who I was lucky enough to work with 25 years ago at BVA, or it might have been a little longer than that, Peter. Peter's a senior manager at HF&H, and he has over 30 years of experience assisting public sector clients with policy, process, financial, and legal issues associated with diversion program implementation and monitoring facility procurements and negotiations. And he's assisting a number of clients currently: the Sacramento Regional Waste Management Authority, the Castro Valley Sanitary District, cities of San Jose, Milpitas, and Mountain View, all with competitive procurements. He also works on commercial system design issues, every other week garbage collection pilot management, and municipal oversight of service providers. So with that, I'll turn it over to Peter. We'll take a few questions after each speaker and more questions at the end.
Great. Thank you, Deborah. Can everyone hear me? I guess so. Good. Well, thank you for joining our session this afternoon. Having been here yesterday and today, there's a predominance of organics focus, as you've probably all noticed in many of the presentations, and that's really very front and center in many people's minds, many of the folks in this room perhaps. So we've modified our presentations just slightly to give a little bit more of an emphasis and to give more examples that relate to organics specifically as you're thinking about those issues. This presentation is from a municipal perspective in terms of the fact that HF&H works with the public sector, not directly with the private sector, but would want to emphasize that our goal is to create partnerships that work between the public and private sectors. And with that in mind, I want to mention that what we'll be talking about today are sort of high points, realizing that what we're covering would actually better suit itself to a class format, perhaps, than a seminar like this. So we'll be sort of bouncing across the tops of a lot of waves, but hopefully impart some useful information along the way. In terms of the title, Negotiating for Results, if you're here because you want to get negotiating tips for how to deal with your spouse or your children, that's not really what this is about. A piece of this will be negotiating with your contractor when you get to that point. But the larger point and why we picked the title is really that putting yourself in position to negotiate a strong contract begins at the very beginning and is reflected in every step along the way as you're engaged in a process. So I'm going to start with a very brief overview of what we'll be covering, the three of us, sort of three broad steps in terms of procurement processes in general and what changes. We'll be pointing out some of the changes that really occur when you're looking at high diversion and zero waste programs, so you're getting further up in diversion. It really boils down to, unfortunately, one key word, which is maybe good for consultants, but that word would be complexity. Things get more complex, they take more time. The more types of programs you're looking at, the more nuance in the programs, et cetera. Whether you're actually doing competitive procurement, that's the framework we're using today to walk through sort of the steps, soup to nuts, if you will. But you might just be doing a piece of this. You might be negotiating some new services with your existing contractor. Hopefully there's pieces of this that will be of assistance also for that. Wherever you are in looking at these three steps, the planning, really the RFP preparation and selection of the contractor, and then negotiation through the transition, you're really looking at determining what you need and want. Hopefully you can get both. Evaluating and selecting a provider, and then moving to implementing the services. So quickly, what I'll be covering in my portion is plan with exclamation mark. I'll be walking through each of these points. I'm not going to summarize them right now, but the key point I want to take away is that it's always tempting to start writing the RFP very early in the process. Sort of like, well, I know what I want. I'm going to sit down and start writing it. The danger of doing that is that you cut off potential options that you might not think about if you don't go through a broader sort of exploration phase, planning phase, if you will. Lauren's going to be covering the evaluation and selection portion of the process. And two things I want to point out just quickly. One that she'll be focusing on and that is really central to the process is what we call Bravo in preparing the RFP. And that's about having both base services well-defined as well as alternative services that you would want to consider selecting and to have individual pricing for. It's sort of like having dim sum, but not quite as tasty. And then under select proposer, I mentioned it before, partner. Ultimately, if you're going to be in a 10 or 15-year arrangement with a private sector, third-party contractor, you want it to be a partnership. It's just not fun if from day one, maybe from the negotiation phase, you realize that this is just not going to work great. Tracy is going to be talking about step 3, negotiating and managing. So negotiating the final agreement and then managing the contract over the term, and particularly through the transition to if you have a new service contractor or if you have substantial new services, even with your current service contractor. So some common regulatory structures, just to sort of put this in context. You can see today's focus is really where there's a strong relationship between municipality and the service provider. So that might occur through an evergreen agreement. It might be a non-exclusive arrangement. It might be an exclusive contract. Any of those would fit. A little less applicable to municipal service if you provide it that way, or if you have more of a permit system where you don't really get into contractual issues per se. And finally, last slide regarding the overview is just there's a number of broad themes. I just want to highlight a few of them right now that you'll hear through the presentations that all three of us will be making. Starting in the upper right, providing adequate time. Come back to that in a little bit of detail. Defining a structured process and sticking with it. Now, the art of that is also having flexibility within that process. Minimizing and managing risk. I'll have a slide where I'll talk a little bit about risk. And just managing your contract actively, not being a passive non-participant in your contract, but managing it actively. So diving into plan. So it may be fairly obvious, but a good starting point is to define goals for the community. They will vary, obviously. It's very community-specific, and it should be. And the relative importance of the different goals are very much community-specific. This is sort of just some examples of goals that both might govern either the process itself for the procurement, as well as what you want to have in the outcome, in the contract and in the rates that you'll have moving forward for the services you select. This is one way that we've used to go about thinking about what those goals are and to make sure that you include everyone in the process that really needs to be. Stakeholders within your agency, stakeholders within the community, obviously, the decision makers, your council. I'm going to come back to a little bit more on stakeholder input in a bit. This is an example from San Jose from a commercial services procurement where they did what was called a redesign of the non-exclusive system and shifted to an exclusive approach to providing those services. And I want to just highlight a couple things that make this sort of specific process for them in terms of looking at political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental issues. Under the political box, the green vision and the mayoral support for that was a very key component. So the mayor himself had goals the council had ratified for the process, and very important driver for how it unfolded. Going over the economic box there, the very inconsistent commercial rates. They had a non-exclusive system and were concerned about rate inequity, where the rates varied very widely between service providers for the same type of service. And under technological is another example where, because of where they are, I mentioned under social, the culture of innovation, being in the hub of tech innovation, they were very interested in emerging technologies and in looking at varied approaches for commercial organics. So time, the element of time. We traditionally at HF&H talk about having an 18-month period from planning through signing of the contract as being sort of a minimum ideal amount to have. As you add complexity, if you're really looking at options for organics, if you're looking at, do we have a wastewater treatment plant we want to utilize? Do we have a regional approach that we want to think about with other parties, et cetera? You need that much more time to do that. And then a 30-month total window that allows for a minimum of a year transition, ideally, to the new service provider. Some of that is just the logistics of ordering trucks, but it's also to have an orderly process for actually bringing new services online. So if there's questions about this, we can come back to it. This is not these are not recommendations. This is just to show what I sort of illustrate, and I think you all noticed complexity. You could add a 0% or maybe a 5% over on the side, which would be, prior to AB 939, procurements were about picking up garbage and putting it in a landfill. So it was pretty simple. As we added diversion goals, we added program to more program to more programs. And now, of course, we're looking with organics at really integrating food recovery also, as the top of the hierarchy, and not just jumping to technical solutions for managing food waste. So regulatory drivers, again, with this audience, you're familiar with all these. What I wanted to highlight here is that it can be a bit of a moving target. Things are moving forward now. As you're aware, AB 1826 is law, but it's phased. So, for instance, we're doing a procurement now where even though some of the services won't be implemented or required to be implemented until after the new contract begins, they're all part of the proposal process. We want to know up front what those services are going to entail, how they're going to be provided, what they're going to cost. The CARB box there, as you know, we're looking at the short-term pollutant policy coming down and looking at potentially organics being something that doesn't go to landfill at all. We're also looking at a 75% goal maybe. So all those pieces, it makes it difficult right now to, if you're in that position, to be looking at procuring services and not really sure what's coming down the pike, not wanting to build in things maybe prematurely that might cost more. In some communities, that decision will be made. It's like, we're fine. We want to be at 75% now. We'll just factor it in or whatever it might be. Or we're willing to process everything and have organics be taken out of landfill now. So it really depends on your community. It depends on your tolerance for, to some degree, for risk and cost. So a key component, very key, is quality data. As you're moving towards, and again, well before you actually have an RFP document, is to start thinking about data. And just a tip, this is something you may be familiar with, and it doesn't really specifically have to do with high diversion, except it's just a matter of it's that much more so if you're looking at high diversion programs. In the private sector, how do they decide whether they're interested in a given process and in participating in it and responding to an RFP? Well, those decisions can be made in part based on what other options they have right then. There's often, even in a like a multinational, there's a small staff that locally works on proposals. And so if they have other opportunities and those opportunities are more appealing, those are the ones that they'll look at first. One way to respond to that challenge is to get on people's schedules early, to let proposers know early on that this is coming. We're interested in you submitting a proposal. Please be aware of it. And other factors you can control are really having what I mentioned, the fair and structured process. If you're not the incumbent, that you feel as a private sector contractor or proposer that you have a reasonable shot at it. It's not just really the incumbent's option and they're trying to get a few other proposals to weigh against it. And finally, this slide, which is really provide the best data you can about current conditions. And it's really invaluable. And it can really be the make or break. I've had these conversations with why did you choose not to propose? Well, we looked at the data and we knew that it wasn't accurate, or we knew it was too incomplete. That coupled with the amount of time, we didn't feel we could respond. This also goes back to time element, which is that you want to allow enough time for strong proposals, and that really is like 2 to 3 month window for a firm to prepare a proposal. Again, if you're looking, that much more so if you're looking at a range of changes in services, if you're looking for them to propose options, et cetera. So we'll get to that in a moment. So the program and processing selection, what we recommend is really to look at your current programs, really understand them, understand if they're providing the results you want. Again, in terms of diversion, and understanding what you're paying for them, and cost per ton or other type of measure for the amount of diversion you're getting. Identify other programs that you would want or need, and again, that's sort of where now 1826 or other organics types of issues may come into play. And the kinds of questions, around the organics issue, as I touched on earlier, you may have a broader set of issues there and a broader set of stakeholders than you're used to dealing with. If you haven't already had that discussion in terms of wastewater treatment plant operations, whether you have them municipally, there may be some co-benefits to using that kind of capacity. And that's another whole set of people in your city or your jurisdiction that you may or may not normally communicate with. And also regionally, are there options that you want to look at regionally that would be more cost effective? Are there other nearby cities that are dealing with these issues also and would benefit, you would benefit and they would benefit from working together? So one little challenge you have when you're thinking about high diversion planning, and it's really true, again, probably of any RFP type of process, but a high diversion or zero waste type of procurement, is do you prescribe what you want, or do you allow proposers to tell you what they can offer? Or do you have some sort of hybrid of those two? The San Jose example here was one where it was prescribed, but a fair amount of flexibility within the prescribed guidelines, if you will, about what the city wanted to receive proposals on. And in that kind of process, there's really more upfront planning because there's more definition that needs to go into what do you want, so you can put it in an RFP in a clear, cohesive way and be understood. The Central Contra Costa example here, this is 5 cities? 5, I believe, cities in Central Contra Costa, Walnut Creek, and a few others. They chose instead to specify a goal. We want 75% diversion. You tell us how we should get there. Now, the one thing that happens when you do that is you hear back from proposers. They say, well, what do you want? We can propose all sorts of things. So that can be a bit of a challenge. It also leads to, in that instance, more work at the back end, because then you don't have apples to apples in the same way necessarily coming out of the proposal process, and you need to think more about how do these options fit with our goals, and potentially could be more subject to challenge because you don't have quite the structured process you had in the San Jose example, where it's a little more like the answer. It's not quite that easy, but the answer pops out at the end since you've set up the process. I want to touch a little bit on financial impacts as you're thinking about the process. So you really want to understand, I'm going to jump through a few of these bullets. You really want to understand your current funding system and options. And we have at least one attorney in the room who maybe will agree that in this environment, you need to be talking to your city attorney early in the process, or your general counsel, whoever that might be, in terms of thinking about fees, Prop 218, Prop 26 issues, increasingly rearing their heads in this area. So. And then this third bullet, make an honest assessment of potential ratepayer impacts and really communicate that effectively. The worst thing to do with your counsel in particular is to set a certain expectation and be quite a ways off in meeting it or failing to meet it. Nothing that, it's true in all aspects of life, right? So creating expectations that will work. So a second slide on the idea of aligning economics. I want to jump down to the third bullet, the value and importance, if you can, of disconnecting hauler compensation and the rates. Really can't be overstated. If you have an enterprise fund now that you can build a reserve in, separate from compensation to the contractor, don't give it away. They're a little harder maybe to establish now with 218 and 26 concerns, and need to be much more cost of service based. If you're going to be building a reserve, why are you doing it? How are you going to use it? How does it relate to the actual costs, whatever that might be? But a very valuable tool to have. It allows you to do pilots independently of the contractor, for instance. There's an example, and you may wish to do one. This might be a good opportunity for me to plug tomorrow's session for Mountain View and Sunnyvale and San Jose, where they'll be talking about food scrap pilots. And by the way, they all separate their compensation from their rates. And one that's not in here that really is important, and we may return to and can talk about later, it is definitely a real challenge, which is you may really want to change your rate structure to accommodate adding organics, say on the commercial side, or for other reasons. You may want to be modifying your rate structure over time. The danger of doing that at the same time that you start new services is you won't know what affected what. You'll have too many variables in play. So ideally, what you want to do on a process like this is tweak some things around the edges if you can. I'll give you an example of that in a moment, which is charge something for commercial recycling, charge something for commercial organics if you're not now. And then down the line, you may need to adjust the rate structure and be doing that. You want to ensure your contract allows you to do that. So these are several. The next two slides are ones that are some of you may have seen from presentations Rob Hilton has done, and I borrowed these. These are what we call pay-as-you-throw 2.0. And this first one here, it's really about communicating not just price signals, but communicating information to those that are subscribing to services, about their options regarding garbage service, recycling, and organics. Not a hugely, I guess I would say something that should be fairly obvious, and maybe you do every day, but it's surprising to what extent people do not understand their options that are in front of them. And then a couple tips to consider. I'm going to touch on just a couple of these given time. Single-family residential, and this is true of commercial too, we would recommend, as you look at rate structuring, to consider flatter structures. You might have pricing differences like $3 to $7, maybe in that range, between 20-gallon, 32, 64, 96, for instance, on the residential side. They can be quite effective in signaling a difference in service, but not resulting in what I would call non-productive migration, where people get the 20s so they can then put their extra garbage in the recycling. Those sorts of situations that you don't want to have. And under commercial multifamily, again, reducing the rate slope, if you will, so those differentials are not so great, and really thinking about frequency more than volume. In both of those cases, that's about looking more towards the cost of service than rate structures under pay-as-you-throw generally do, which is that, it's every time the truck goes down the street that's expensive. It's not how much they're picking up per stop that's expensive. So with the commercial structure, you really want to set up ways to encourage people to use the lowest frequency they can and benefit from that. And the last one is charging for recycling and organic services. So we have a current procurement where we, following the sort of dictum I just mentioned about not modifying the entire rate structure, even though we would actually like to, it's fairly antiquated, before starting the new contract. One of the changes we are making is to provide some charge for commercial recycling. Right now it's offered for free, and we'll be making that a 75% reduction from solid waste. That's what we're looking at right now, so a 25% of the solid waste rate. And that really has to do with sustainability of funding, having a rate structure that is sustainable, that's producing the revenue that you need as programs change, as subscription levels change, as migration occurs, doing everything you can to minimize that risk. So, completely changing gears. Stakeholder input. I just want to make a quick couple comments on this. First, during the planning phase, it's just crucial, and you probably all know this. I'm probably speaking again to the choir here. I want to give a couple examples, though I think they're particularly effective. For the council and board meetings, if you have a system, and it's sort of a cultural thing, it seems to me, I've found in cities where the council is comfortable and likes to do study sessions, take full advantage of that. The opportunity to be in front of your council in an informal setting where they know they're not making decisions that day, it's like night and day. They're much more relaxed, and you may have seen this if you have that kind of process. There are cities that almost never do study sessions. Everything is out. It's either like closed session or it's out in public forum. These are public. They're noticed. But, people aren't going to come unless they're really interested. But they become very much the opportunity for a discussion. Mountain View does these very effectively, I think, where staff really has the opportunity to have a dialogue, almost an ongoing dialogue with the council. So they are completely on board and understanding what's happening before they have to make decisions. I wanted to jump down to surveying and social media engagement just very quickly. I think survey is just such a powerful tool. If you don't use it, and I'd really recommend it, and I think it's that much more so with high diversion. If you're looking at program changes, and particularly if you're looking at them in the residential sector, for instance, if you're looking at, am I going to co-collect food with yard trimmings, or am I going to collect it separately? The council will feel very happy to have that kind of data to rely on. Very, very happy. It provides a real comfort zone. And ideally, you structure a survey such that you get results, and some of it's luck probably, you get results that are unequivocal. 78% of respondents liked doing this or didn't like doing this. That's a good number. Social media engagement, I just wanted to touch on quickly to say, and again, this is probably something you're all aware of, that the role of social media has become so huge. A couple things. One is if you can be using platforms to be in touch with your community about programs on an ongoing basis, if you're fortunate enough to have that kind of, again, sort of a dialogue going with interested parties in your community, that will put you in very good stead when you start doing a procurement and when rumors start going around about they're going to take services away and they're going to charge us more. And before that becomes the main message on Nextdoor, is do everything you can to be out in front of that. And it's much easier if you already have an established communication through social media. So, environmental review, I have one more slide after this one, and then I am going to sit down. Okay. Environmental review, very quickly, again with interpretations more recently more environmental review is being done around collection and processing procurements than in the past. Sometimes it's really focused on transport issues and looking at greenhouse gases and criteria pollutants. I don't know if the statistic was mentioned yesterday, and in one of the sessions, and many of you may be familiar with it, that the benefits of taking organics out of landfill are a little bit like driving to Buenos Aires and back with that same material. So huge benefits. So if you do a transport analysis, make sure you factor in the benefits of the fact that material, the organics material, that is not going to be disposed anymore. And you'll have a good result. Maximizing reward and minimizing risk. This is my final slide. So you really want to maximize what you want and minimize the risks in getting it. I mean, that's what it's all about, right? And so you need to first identify risks. So again, that's importance of planning, not just sort of jumping into drafting the RFP and sending it out, but really think through what are the risks that I'm entailing potentially for my community, as well as what does the contractor face. Eliminate the risks that can be eliminated, minimize risks that cannot be eliminated, and then really balance what's left in a fair way between the contractor and the ratepayers. And it's difficult again, when you go back to moving targets for diversion, unknown areas, unknown costs moving forward. I asked Matt Cotton yesterday, if you're a community that has a reasonably good price offered for mixed yard trimmings and food scraps, should you sign up for that for 10 or 15 years? And he said, well, I'll have to think about that. But that's the kind of decision you might be faced with. Is this something I want to get locked into right now? So I want to close quickly my part by just talking a little bit about why minimizing contractor risk is important. You might think that, well, why do I care about their risk? I'm thinking about my risk. Anything that helps proposers understand possible risk, as I mentioned, increases their interest in being in a competitive process, and will increase the number of proposals you get. To the degree they propose and they identify risks that they don't know how to ameliorate, they will price that risk in. So you get higher prices, padding, if you will. And it's a reasonable response. I don't know what's going to happen here. I don't want to get stuck holding the bag. I need to add in cost. And also those unidentified risks will be priced, either if they're not priced in, they may pop up later and be one of those surprises that you don't really want to have to deal with. And when that happens, then you can be in a position of having a surprise for your council or for other parties, the ratepayers. So with that, am I saying thank you, Deborah?
Okay, are there any questions for Peter? I think he did a great job of talking about the importance. Thank you, Peter. He did a great job of talking about the importance of planning before we get to the RFP phase and thinking about rates, requirements, and goals. Are there any questions related to what Peter talked about today? A couple questions, Colleen.
Excellent presentation. Can you speak a little bit? I noticed in that one slide that you have two examples that talk about the different ways, social media, council meetings, things like that. Both of those communities, I guess, did not do any citizen or stakeholder meetings. Can you speak as to why that was the case, and any advice on communities that have a strong desire for citizen participation?
It's about stakeholder participation.
To essentially avoid failure when you work something out.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of a matter of how you define them. They both did public community workshops, and they sort of used that process, broadly noticed type of workshop, and a number of them as a way to get input. So I don't know if that helps. It's really more that they don't have a specific committee or commission working with a community now that does have an active commission. You know, some cities have lots of commissions, and it can be very beneficial. I mentioned the example of the surveying. In this particular community, we did a survey, but we also had sort of talked through the survey with the commission, if you will, and that sort of helped in steering the sort of service package that the council felt comfortable signing off on. So I don't know if that addresses your question. Okay.
One more question. Is there one more question?
One more question. In your San Jose example, you went from a non-exclusive system to an exclusive system for commercial. I saw on your slide. Where did the motivation come from that, and how was the political will done?
Can we talk about that afterwards? I should probably restate the question. I think we're supposed to do that. In the San Jose example, the commercial sector had a non-exclusive system, and there was a decision to make that an exclusive system. And what was the driver, maybe, or drivers in the political will? No, I can probably give a short answer to that. Diversion was a very key part of it. The mayor and the council had a 10-point green goal program, and by God, they wanted that implemented. And a key part of that was zero waste. And when the staff started thinking about zero waste, I mean, they knew this before, the commercial sector's diversion rate was about 23%. And they went through a process, actually really a multi-year process of talking, looking at options before they got to, we're going to have an exclusive system. It wasn't just a direct jump. That included hundreds of meetings with businesses that staff conducted. So a great deal of that kind of work. There was looking at the rate structure issue, or rates I mentioned. There was a differential for the same service level of up to a factor of 10 between what one customer was paying with hauler A and another customer was paying with hauler B. It was pretty amazing. So that was an issue. The process then ended up going back to diversion very quickly, was structured to get to 75% diversion for the commercial sector, and that in fact happened within a year. So it's not necessarily that was the only way they could have increased diversion that dramatically, but they felt in their case, it's not the right decision for every community, but in their case that the non-exclusive system was not working. And finally, there were some fiscal issues called the general fund. Sure. Yeah.
Before we get too off the topic, in response to the outreach question, surveying is another really great way to solicit ratepayer input if the survey's developed well. We're currently doing this in the town of Truckee, and we've had just an overwhelming response. And we've been able to, if you ask, are you aware of these programs? Yes, no. If you are aware of them, do you use them? Then you get some really great data on how people are using those programs. And then lastly, are you satisfied with them? And if not, why? And we've been able to get a lot of great input on how people are using them, how they can be changed, and maybe what elements of those programs people like or don't like. So that surveying can be a really great tool. Yeah, just like.
You tried that in a community that
It has lack of access? Well, I guess the danger of doing that, if the only way you do it is you will get skewed results. You'll get those who do have access. That can be dangerous. Often it's useful to, in fact, we recently did this in Milpitas, a city in Santa Clara County, with both an email survey, which was a link sent to them from a voter registration list, and it couldn't be transferred. So it was their link to take the survey if they wished. But then the community was also very interested in making sure that the demographic profile, if you will, of the community be reflected in the surveys. So they also did many phone surveys, direct phone surveys, to round that out to really reflect the ethnic makeup of the community. So,
Okay, thank you, Peter and Lauren. So I want to introduce Lauren Barbieri. She's a project manager with HF&H, and she has 8 years of experience working with government, agency, private sector partnerships, and has focused on achieving environmental benefits through franchise agreements. And during her time at HF&H, she's provided a wide range of franchising, procurement, contract negotiation, rate setting, and audit assistance to over 50 municipal agencies. So Peter gave you an overview, an introduction, and talked through the planning process and how to think through your goals. And Lauren will be talking about developing the RFP package, evaluating and selecting contractors. Okay, I'll turn it over to Lauren.
Thank you, Deborah. And thanks, Peter, for getting us off to a good start. Okay. Developing the RFP package. So, first of all, you'll notice that the slide says RFP package, and of course stands for Request for Proposals, which I'm sure everyone in this room knows. But sometimes we forget that there are other styles of competitive procurement processes, for example, a request for bids or an invitation to bid. And while I generally like to consider myself a pretty open-minded individual, if you want to do a procurement that's focused on high diversion services, we strongly suggest that you use a request for proposals package that's going to allow you to select the best all-around proposer, as opposed to a request for bids that's going to limit you to the low-cost service provider. And so some may think it goes without saying, but I think it's an important nuance, so I'm saying it. So these are the primary components of any RFP process. You've got your services on the top row, your the costs and how those costs are transferred to your ratepayers in the middle, and then, of course, the agreement that describes and documents all of the above. So first, we're going to talk about our services. So in structuring the services portion of your RFP, we suggest using, as Peter said, what we call the Bravo approach. And the story behind it is, if you are planning to add services with high diversion goals in mind, the services that you're procuring are not the goal. The services are a way of achieving that goal. And as staff, you're going to be working with your elected officials to determine what that goal is, but you want to leave room for innovation and creativity in how you get to that goal without, and this is the key, without compromising the effectiveness and the integrity of your evaluation process. So that's why we developed Bravo. And getting back to the broad themes that Peter discussed, this is really finding that intersection between defining a structured process and creating flexibility. So in the Bravo approach, we suggest that you develop a menu of service options and then get pricing for each. And what this entails is first soliciting pricing on the status quo, and we call that the base, and then require that proposers identify the incremental additional costs or savings, sometimes they're savings, for each additional program that you know you're interested in. We call those the required alternatives. And then lastly, you want to create opportunity for proposers to get creative with optional services, but in a structured format. So the key is to be able to evaluate programs apples to apples and to be able to isolate your program costs, first you need to solicit the base proposals, and then you need to get incremental pricing per additional program that you're interested in. And then in terms of pilots and phasing, the idea is that you not only want to solicit your proposals in a way that lets you pick which programs you want, but also in a way that allows you to select when you implement them. So, for example, there's been a lot of talk about the food waste hierarchy. You know, maybe you're going through this process and you've got your heart set on food recovery or food rescue. And so you get pricing in on that and you realize, well, maybe it's a little too expensive or too disruptive to implement right away. But what you've done is, if you've used this process, you've locked pricing in a competitive environment, and you can consider implementing it down the road. And the last thing to consider, another way to give yourself some flexibility and options, is to solicit your processing and disposal separately from your collection. And since this Bravo concept may be new to some of you, and since we feel very strongly about its benefits, I want to spend just a little bit more time on it. From an options standpoint, as I discussed on the last slide, it's great because you get this menu of options and you can craft this, customized suite of services. But the real reason to do it, and the reason you probably won't really deeply understand this until you're up to your neck in the process, but it allows you to really understand what you're buying, and then allows you to clearly communicate that to your elected officials and ratepayers. And this is really important. That's where the managing sticker shock idea comes from. But it's really important because the underlying reality of any RFP process is, particularly if your services haven't been bid out in a number of years, the cost of providing your base services, so your status quo, will have changed. Almost definitely have changed since the last time you got pricing estimates on them. And you don't want your evaluation of your new services that you're really excited about to be muddied with this general market reset that would have to happen on your base services anyways. So if you use the Bravo approach, then you get that market reset on the services that you're used to as the base proposals, and then you can decide what you want to add or change based on what your community is comfortable paying for. And again, in terms of phasing in programs or using pilots, if you use this format, you've locked pricing in a competitive environment for each new program. So then you can choose to roll out programs at a pace that your community is comfortable with. And to illustrate this, and also to show that it works in a variety of contexts and with a variety of factors, sticking with the San Jose example, we're going to take a look at how this was used here. So as background, as Peter said, they were using this RFP to, among other things, to move away from a non-exclusive system to an exclusive franchise arrangement. So as a result, they didn't have an applicable base services scenario because they were dramatically changing the system. So as their first base, they asked for pricing on a standard 3-container system and then treated that as the market reset. So that's sort of coming up to standard. But then they were really interested in wet-dry and wondering, if that would be possible in their community. But it was riskier and it's a little different because there's less known about it. There's less data points to compare to. So they asked for that as the second base. And they wouldn't want to ask for pricing only on wet-dry because there is a chance that pricing would come in way higher than what they're comfortable with, and they wouldn't know if that big jump was related to moving to the exclusive system or if it was related to moving to this kind of new edgy system, and they wanted to be able to isolate those changes. So requiring the proposers submitted the 2 distinct proposals enabled the city to look at wet-dry relative to a more standard system, and that's really the key to this whole Bravo. And as Peter mentioned, environmental review comes up here because you want to make sure it's built into your process. So you want to be thinking ahead to what you're going to need to go through an environmental review process so you can ask for that data from your proposers. And this includes thinking about who's going to pay for it and when in the process you'll do it. So the idea is you don't want to leave this to the end when you're doing your CEQA or whatever other environmental review you have to do. You want to be planning for it throughout. Okay, done with our services. This is our financing system. So as part of the proposals, we always require proposers to complete a detailed set of cost forms in Excel. And so when we say solicit separate pricing, that's what we mean. It's kind of filling out these separate cost forms. And the key takeaway here is that you're soliciting costs and not rates. And by costs, I mean the cost what it will cost for the hauler to do the work, not how you're going to collect enough rate revenue to cover those costs. Your rate structure is part of your overall strategy, and it's it's something that you're going to be working on with your with staff, with your elected officials. It's going to involve some policy decisions about what pricing signals you're sending to your ratepayers, and it's on this slide because they're related to each other, but they're not the same. And we want to make sure that you solicit costs and not rates. But your cost proposal is not just about costs. We also strongly recommend that you solicit operating information along with that, because you don't know if you have good cost data unless you can look at it in the context of those operating assumptions. So the example I like to use is, if you get your proposals in and one is 50% cheaper than the rest, and you're thinking, wow, that's a really great deal. But then you look at the operating assumptions and you realize, well, they also proposed half as many routes as everyone else. And so not only is it not necessarily as great of a deal as you thought, they might actually be missing some pretty significant aspects of what providing service in your area entails. So you need that good operating data to back up your cost data. And the last point on here, we recommend that if you're making big changes to your services, you should avoid making simultaneous big changes to the rate structure, kind of keeping in the same theme of what Bravo means. You want to isolate your changes to the greatest extent possible. Okay. Moving on to the agreement. There's a lot of really great tips here. I'm not going to read through all of them. The kind of two big takeaways I want to leave you all with. One, we strongly or emphatically encourage all agencies to include a complete draft franchise agreement as part of the RFP package. And this not only simplifies things at the end of your process, when you want to be happily working with your hauler to think about the future of your programs, you don't want to be spending a month fighting about how you're going to turn a 10-page term sheet into an 100-page agreement. But also because there's a lot more to a long-term agreement than just describing how your collection services are provided. And proposers need to know all aspects of the deal that they're proposing on if they're going to give you a good, tight proposal. And the second takeaway from this slide is that every aspect of your agreement should reflect and support your high diversion goals. So your high diversion themes really should be systemic throughout the agreement. And this starts at a very cosmetic level with the terminology that you're using. Is it a waste and recycling and organics agreement, or is it a recycling and organics and residual materials agreement? So it can start at that level, but then it, of course, goes deeper. You're going to want to avoid tonnage commitments. If your programs are working, your material streams are going to be changing, so you want to reserve the right to be flexible. You want to have a process for conducting a detailed review to make changes midterm if you need to support your programs. But coupled with that, you want to make sure that you're limiting sort of what deserves a detailed review, because that can be somewhat of a slippery slope. You also want to have detailed reporting requirements and the ability to audit so that you can track the success of your programs, and Tracy's going to be speaking to that. And getting back to our broad themes again, you're creating room for flexibility and innovation within a structured process. And that's sort of the key theme of how you want to draft your high diversion agreement. Okay, so now you have released your expertly crafted RFP and you've got your proposals in. And the next step is evaluating proposals and selecting your new partner. So I'm just going to close out with two quick slides on this topic. So we've broken the evaluation process out into three sort of key phases. The first step is when you get your proposals in and you sort of close yourself in your office and you read them cover to cover, and that's a little bit like Christmas at my house. It's very exciting because this is when you get to see garbage nerds on parade. That's me. This is when you get to see what your new baseline is, and also when you get to see data points on those alternative services that you were interested in but maybe you weren't so sure about. And once you have those pieces, you can start doing some cost-benefit analysis on what those new programs would actually look like in your community. And also you can start to benchmark against maybe what you planned and also against industry standards. So then once you get through that first step and you've narrowed down that big menu of options down to sort of the handful of services that you really feel strongly about, some agencies, not all, but some agencies choose to solicit best and final offers on that narrower set of services. Some people call it a BAFO. The step's not always needed, but it's a handy tool to kind of have in your pocket. Peter talked about risk. So at this point now you've removed some of the risk that's associated with this huge menu of options, and so maybe there might be some room for haulers to sharpen their pencils a little bit. But that's up to you in that stage of the process. Then it's time to select your winner or winners. You may select multiple. And if you've used a request for proposals process, you've given yourself the ability to not just select the low-cost provider and instead find the contractor that genuinely offers the best services at the best value, and specifically the best value for your community. It's also at this point that you'll want to start deciding whether to implement those new services right away or if there's any that you want to hold back. And then the last piece, you see the clouds on the side, deciding when to include stakeholders and elected officials. This is a decision that you've likely made or at least considered during the planning stages of your process, and it's going to reflect your community and your elected officials' style, so it's going to be different for everybody. But at this point, you may find that you want to tweak that strategy based on the number and nature of the proposals that you've received. So, maybe you had a plan to bring all of the proposals in front of council, and then you get your proposals in and you got twice as many as you anticipated and 3 are non-responsive. You might not want to bring all those proposals in front of council because it's going to confuse people. So maybe you just go with the short list instead. The point is that at this point you need to officially decide, and then commit to what you're bringing to council or committees or subgroups and when you're bringing it, and you need to have a clear idea of the direction that you need from them if you are in fact looking for direction instead of just educating. And last but not least, we need to quickly consider environmental review again. In terms of the review itself, you'll want your agency to control and conduct the review. In terms of timing, you have to decide when you want to do it, if you want to do it before or after the final contractor selection. And akin to that, you need to decide if you want to be focusing on one proposer's specific approach, or if you want to sort of back up and focus on the shortlisted proposer's more general approach, and that there's pros and cons to each of those, or maybe like horror stories and less horror stories. Some of the things that you'll be looking at are those listed on the bottom. So traffic, how many trucks you have on the road, how far your materials will be transported, and how they'll be processed. So that brings us to the end of this portion. I can answer questions on this chunk, or I can hand it off.
Take 1 or 2 questions. A couple questions before we move on. Anybody? First here.
You were talking about getting the stakeholder or elected official buy-in at some point. Would it be appropriate to do it once you get to like the BAFO stage if you want to narrow that scope down and have kind of like more of a finalized approach where you've gone through the other initial evaluation to get to that point? Is that more of an appropriate time to bring it to, you think?
In terms of appropriate, it really is up to your council and how they work with staff, and how the city manager works with staff and how they work with council. So I don't want to say appropriate or not appropriate because it really is unique. That is certainly an option.
Yeah. The question I think was when to do a BAFO, or best and final offer, and is it best after you've gone to council?
I was using the context of, like you were saying, maybe you were expecting to get 3 proposals, you got 10 proposals,
right.
And you're like, okay, I need to weed this down because I don't want to take this to a group of elected officials. So I'm thinking about that industry, and what I want to wait to the BAFO stage where I can take that 10 and maybe narrow it down to 3.
Yeah, it might be 2 steps. You might go to council with the 10 and say, here's our recommendation. We're not going to give you all the detail of these 3 or these 6 that we don't think you want to consider. We're happy to answer questions. And then to talk to them about, based on what we do see from the proposals that you would want to consider, here are some options. And then you might want to do a BAFO, best and final offer. It's not something you need to do, but it may be of value to do at that point to say, well, we're looking at these several options. 2 of the 3 shortlisted proposers offered it and 1 didn't. We'd like to get that 3rd one, as well as the other 2, to give us prices for that again. That'd be an example. Sometimes it's very specific. In the San Jose example, just very quickly, at that point in time, this is a few years ago, now CNG vehicles are very standard. At that time, they weren't. And they asked for alternative fuels, and they got a whole menu of different fuels. So the BAFO was really just simply saying, please all propose on the same fuel and tell us what it would be.
Hillary had a question.
Do you know what you define as a hard line separation between the evaluation phase and the selection phase? Is there one?
Give me tricky questions here. So the question was, what's the hard line between evaluation and selection? So there are a few stages in the evaluation process. So you're going to do a first pass for compliance, just to make sure everyone followed all the rules. Then you'll put together some sort of summary and get details. When you actually select, it really, again, it gets back to this idea of how involved your council wants to be. Maybe you're going to negotiate 2 entire agreements with your top 2, and you'll bring 2 signed agreements to council. I've done that a number of times. So there is some range in how cities deal with it. Tracy and Peter, do you want to talk to that specifically?
Maybe just quickly to say that it's not over until it's over. So you don't want to preclude options and make a decision prematurely if you can avoid it, I think from a municipal point of view. So that may mean that you could be in a situation where you go back to council several times. If that's the case, they need to understand that, and they need to have bought into that kind of process in the beginning, where you may be narrowing down options so that they, ideally, you get them to a situation where it's an obvious choice. That's the best position to be in. And councils often really appreciate that, or other elected boards, as opposed to, I'm supposed to make a decision? Thanks.
Move on, and we'll take some more questions at the end. Okay, let's thank Lauren for her excellent presentation. Okay, our last speaker is Tracy Swanborn, also with HF&H. She's a senior manager with more than 25 years of experience assisting municipal agencies. And her expertise is in collection, transfer, processing, disposal services, procurement, contract development, and negotiations. She's managed over 18 competitive RFP projects and several sole source contract negotiations. And she's currently managing a procurement process for Santa Cruz County and 2 sole source contract negotiations for Bay Area City. So Tracy's going to be talking to us about the negotiations process, implementation, and ongoing management of your contract. Okay, thank you, Tracy.
Thank you for the introduction, Deborah. Just to follow up on those 2 questions, I think one of the things that is real about these processes is that one size does not fit all. As much as you might like one size to fit all, our procurement processes and the way you work through these decisions is really customized and unique to each agency. So with that, let me jump into my presentation. I'll be starting with the contract negotiations portion of this. Peter mentioned some themes. Flexibility and risk management are really key as we think about the contract process. And what we want to accomplish is getting to a win-win agreement. And for us, we really think about a win-win agreement being an agreement in which both the parties, the agency and the contractor, feel like there's a good balance of risk, and both parties feel like they can ultimately get to the goals that they want out of the contract process. As we work towards getting a win-win, we keep 3 fundamental principles in mind. One is avoiding surprises. 2 is establishing a good working relationship, and 3 is focusing those negotiations. In terms of avoiding the surprises, Lauren talked about including a draft agreement with the RFP, and this is really critical. It does several things. It sets the proposers up so they know exactly what they're bidding on. They know the details of the terms and conditions. They will not be surprised during negotiations. It also helps the agency because the agency will receive red line versions of the proposers' agreements, so the agencies aren't surprised at what concerns the proposers have, and they can select proposers that they believe they can work successfully through contract negotiations with. It also helps in the negotiations because you're going to be able to narrow the focus of your conversations on those red line changes and keep your eye on working to resolve those issues that are before you. The other important thing is when you're negotiating this, you're looking at easily 7 to 10-year relationship, if not more, sometimes as much as 12 or 15 years. So setting the tone during negotiations of having a solid working relationship is really essential. You want to get off on the right foot with this relationship. And one of the keys to do that is to really understand the risks and be sensitive to the contractor's risks and work to provide reasonable solutions that they will be satisfied with and allow them to be good partners in a long-term relationship. It's particularly important with high diversion because you're going to be working towards your high diversion goal or your zero waste, and it's likely that you're going to need to make changes over the term of the contract and want to be able to negotiate. You need a good relationship to be able to do those negotiations effectively. So the themes we've been talking about, one of the key is flexibility, and that's really essential as we think about the contracts and balancing those risks. We need to address in the contract how you can respond over time to changes. A couple items I have here are things that you really can't predict. Changes in law, changes in scope of services. You might have some ideas, but you might not know when those changes will be coming, and you need to work in the contracting phase to identify a process by which you'll handle those changes, both the change in law or openers for change in scope, and those ideas might be introduced by the proposers or the agencies. And really, those two need to be supported with having a mechanism in the contract to make changes to costs and rates, because the only way those changes are going to work, the only comfort you're going to give your contractor when you go to make those changes is to also be able to adjust the compensation and rates. And that's why the Bravo process that Lauren talked about is really helpful. You're going to get detailed costs and detailed operating statistics that puts you in a great position to negotiate those changes. And you may even have solicited alternative proposals for changes in scope that you might implement later. I've also identified on this chart the importance of having the ability to dig into the reporting and periodically request records and do reviews of your contractor services. This helps you better understand where you are with the services, where you are in terms of working towards your goals, and then you can plan some flexibility around making changes. So let's assume you've been able to successfully negotiate your contract. I think often agencies think, it's over. That's great. We did such a good job. We'll just let the contractor take it from here. But you actually have to stay really engaged in the process and be involved in managing the transition. And we define the transition period as the time from the contract execution date through the start date, and then a few months into the contract as things sort of settle down. So you're going to need to be involved. Really key is being engaged and being in constant communication so that you can identify risks early on when they're just small problems, and then help and work with your contractor to manage any of those issues and come up with a resolution so ultimately you have a very successful and smooth transition process. This is not hard to do. It's not complicated. I was going to use the city of Newark as an example. They transitioned a few years ago from one hauler to another. But these transition steps would be the same if you're working with your current hauler and maybe negotiated new programs and are transitioning services there. The key is that you need to set up a framework for that transition monitoring, typically built around regular meetings. Most often in the beginning, say it's a 10-month or 12-month process, you might meet monthly, and then as the date gets closer for implementation, you'll shift to biweekly or maybe weekly meetings. You'll develop a very detailed timeline in the beginning. You'll work with the proposed timeline that was in the contractor's proposal and probably add more details to that and make sure you have the critical path elements linked up so you know what to focus on as you're moving through that transition phase and engaging with the contractor to understand how things are going. Periodically, you'll want to verify that the contractors accomplish specific things. They say they ordered their equipment and the vehicles will be here on time. Ask for confirmation from the equipment supplier. They're going to be ordering their carts. Ask to see the specifications. Make sure those specifications are in alignment with the contract requirements. Make sure the labeling on the containers are consistent with what you're looking for. Be active and be involved. As the start date gets closer, work with your contractor to make sure you understand what additional staffing they're going to have on the ground, what additional route supervisors will be there, or what additional customer service reps will be there to handle the peak call volumes and peak service needs. Key element in Newark's case is they knew there was going to be a tremendous amount of public education and outreach in terms of communicating with the customers about the transition. So they had a specific timeline built around when the draft materials would be prepared and when they would be reviewing those, so that they were involved in looking at those materials, helping with the messaging, and helping with the look and feel of that. And that really turned out to be key in the success of their transition. That timeline is going to outline a whole bunch of areas that you'll be focusing on over the course of monitoring the transition. I'm not going to get into those. I'm happy to answer some questions during the Q&A. But what I wanted to point out here is the way to understand if your transition is going smoothly is to be just asking a lot of questions. Any question you can think of, the obvious ones, the silly ones, the one that might make you feel stupid. Ask about contingencies. Ask for verification. That's how you're going to find out if there's issues. And you want to find out early. That's really the key theme of monitoring the transition, is to be monitoring so you know about problems early and then can work to manage solutions around those. And there's no doubt there's going to be issues. It's just about finding them early, having that good relationship to work through them. And the point I want to come back to is possibly needing to be flexible. You might need to modify or compromise some elements of your original transition plan, maybe even make some changes in terms of the rollout approach. So the last portion of my presentation talks about the ongoing contract management. I see people can see from the back of the room. I don't know. The quote that I have up here is that contracts are like cars. They don't run themselves except downhill. So like the transition phase, I sometimes see agencies that want to sit back and relax. The same thing happens after the rollout. They think it's all over. The contract's just going to proceed along and our contractor's going to work diligently. But you need to be working diligently too. You need to be managing your contract on an ongoing basis. I don't think you want to be the agency that finds out a year and a half into your contract that your diversion rates are down, or you find out a few years into your contract that your franchise fees aren't generating what you thought they were. You need to be proactive in your contract management so that you know what's going on and then can resolve those problems. In terms of the contract management, the first thing is you need to do some planning, like Peter talked about. Same goes for the contract management process. Define responsibilities, profile your contract requirements. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Develop tracking tools that make your job easy and to make them effective. Build Excel spreadsheets so you can monitor trends and things. I think the key point I want to make on this slide is that you want to set expectations. You want your contractor to realize that you're going to be engaged, you're going to be focused on the contract on an ongoing basis, and that you're expecting that they will fulfill all the requirements of the contract and perform up to the performance standards defined therein. So when I say you want to know your contract, you really want to know the details. The contract's organized around sort of a legal framework, but as a contract manager, you need to think about organizing in a different way. You want to profile your contract. This is an example from the City of Oakland for one of their franchise agreements. It's got 170 rows identifying various milestones. It lists the relevant contract sections, some additional notes, and then it lists the reporting or the timing of those events, monthly, quarterly, annually, on demand. You need to spend the time up front going through this, and then this will guide you through your monitoring process. So now you've set the plan up for monitoring and you move into the actual monitoring activities. There are really three key focus areas. One is getting those reports in, reviewing them for accuracy, and then monitoring trends. And then looking at how those trends are shaping up around the goals that you've set. You may have goals built into your contract in terms of diversion requirements, or how many customers are signed up for the new organics programs, or how many pounds of materials are being collected per household or per business. You need to make sure you have those goals set and then monitor your progress towards them. The third piece here is to assess that the contractor is complying with the contract. Sometimes this seems like an obvious statement, but there's so many things in the contract. For example, the public education exhibit to your contract might be 3 pages long. There's lots of details. You need to be looking at that and making sure that the contractor is implementing those pieces. I mentioned developing tools. You really want to build yourself a really good spreadsheet or database to track the trends and monitor your progress towards goals. Here's one example of just a simple one, tracking the gross rate receipts that come in from the ratepayers and checking that against your franchise fees. We have seen in many cases where agencies aren't monitoring this closely, and they find out that there's a problem with their fees, and they don't find out for a few years down the road. And then they're really in a pickle trying to resolve that problem. But if you're tracking and monitoring things, you'd see, like this example, that the franchise fees are starting to fall off, and they're really a percentage of the gross receipts and should be tracking along with them. The other thing on franchise fees is we typically build flexibility in the contract for you to periodically audit the franchise fees to confirm that the calculations behind those fees, the reported gross receipts, are consistent with the books, the accounting that the contractor has in place. And in many cases, we find that the agencies have received shortfalls in hundreds of thousands of dollars in payments, even millions of dollars of payments. So it's important to build that into your contract and then use it from time to time. Assessing customer service can be really helpful. This isn't something you want to do all the time, but if you're an agency looking at extending your contract, this is a good time to assess customer satisfaction levels. Or if you're getting a lot of complaints, you might want to dig deeper by checking in with the customers. A couple ways you can do that. Certainly you can look at the contractor's complaint log and see what type of complaints are coming in, dig deeper into that, consider assessing liquidated damages, or just work with your contractor to develop an action plan for improving that quality of service. The other thing that we talked about earlier are the surveys. We've had really great success with the web-based surveys like SurveyMonkey. We get response rates as much as 20% out of the community to get feedback from them on what they think about the services and what they're happy with. And lastly, the good traditional public meeting is always available to capture other people in the audience. So obviously I'm promoting this really proactive approach to contract management. It has a lot of benefits. I think in terms of those of you looking at high diversion, one of the biggest benefits is to be actively looking at the data that's coming in and looking at where your targets are. And then you can be managing and making changes and even thinking about new programs that you might need to move further towards your goal. The other piece that I've been, focused on is that you can identify issues early on and then work cooperatively with your contractor to work through and resolve those issues. And certainly, even with the best contract management, there are things that are going to come up during the course of the contract, and just want to touch quickly on how to work through that. There may be changes in scope that come up, changes in regulations, issues that surface about unexpected revenues coming in, falling short of projections, or customer subscription levels changing more than anticipated. So you may find yourself in a situation where you need to consider how to handle that. The first step is to look at your franchise agreement. There's often lots of provisions that you planned and you built in when you put that contract in place. Change in scope provisions, change in law, dispute resolution. Sometimes there's specific provisions you built in about change in tonnage, rate revenues, customer service. Look at the language, pull that language out if you need to, review that with your legal counsel, and form a strategy for how you're going to tackle the negotiations. And if there is a specific procedure in your contract for how to deal with these issues, follow it. Trigger that formal review process and then follow that negotiations efforts. Try to put some time frames around this so that you wrap up the negotiations in a reasonable period. And then once you're finished with the negotiations, I encourage you to document that formally through an amendment of the contract. We do work with agencies from time to time that document agreements through side letters, through emails, and sometimes even through verbal agreements. The best laid plan is to take the time to amend the contract and have the parties execute the contract. That way, if there's changes in staff or other things that occur, you have it more formally documented. So that's the end of my presentation. Kind of just to review, in terms of the negotiations process, it's really about balancing that risk and thinking about how to build flexible terms and conditions into the contract to accomplish that. And then it's about being very proactive in the transition monitoring and contract monitoring so that you're not surprised by things and you can work towards your goals. So thank you very much. So do we have a few minutes for questions? Anybody have anything they'd like to ask? Yes?
I have a general question when it comes to RFP preparation. Have you ever seen one that recoups the cost of hiring a consultant like yours into the winning bidder? That kind of phase?
Every single one of ours does. So the selected proposer, typically what happens within about 10 days of the effective date, then they're obligated to remit the cost of the consulting services back to the agency. We do most often allow that cost to be recovered, spread out over, say, the 10-year term of the contract and incorporate into the rates. Other times we actually disallow that as an allowable cost and ask them to pay that. Yes?
Kind of second to his question. Do you ever see some funding being set aside to pay for a contract manager at the agency to manage the actual agreement?
So the question was, do we ever see funding being set aside through the contract to pay for a contract manager? I think we have a great example right here in the room. Roberto Munoz, I believe, is funded directly through a fee that's been included in the Union City franchise for that purpose. And we see lots of other agencies looking at those types of solutions to help have staff that's available to manage the contract on an ongoing basis and provide technical assistance they need to customers. Oh, hang on, Peter wants to add something.
I can't resist. Sorry. I'm not going to name the city or the hall, but we had a recent situation where the incumbent was chosen to continue service, but part of the council had concerns about that decision. And as part of the final negotiation, they agreed to pay for both a city position and for a position dedicated by the company for managing the contract with the city. Previously, they hadn't had that level of involvement, but they also paid for the city position. So.
David, did I see your hand up?
Question about the best and final offer process. If I understood it right, you're giving kind of the short list of proposers an opportunity to basically resubmit bids, even on things that maybe that they didn't propose but someone else proposed. If that's the case, isn't there a lot of risk in that? And I'm thinking of a certain Bay Area city that recently had an experience. Isn't that a risk of being accused of kind of letting everybody rebid after they saw the initial bids?
That certainly is a risk, and I can't speak for the companies, but I can only imagine that that's a frustrating process for them. But it proves to be effective in some circumstances, and I want to say there's many, many RFP processes that we run that there is no best and final. The proposals that are put on the table are the proposals that are brought to the council and are the selected proposals. But there are certain agencies that really like to use that as a tool, or that there was enough sort of variability in the proposals that came in that they do want to get everybody to present a service package that is consistent across the board. And so they go ahead with that process. But there certainly are pros and cons to using that technique and an approach.
I just suggest not confusing a BAFO with a rebid. They're two different things. So if you're doing a best and final, you want to be very careful that you circumscribe what it is you're asking for and really limit changes in compensation or proposed costs to those services. Shouldn't be an opportunity to just repropose. Once you've done that, then you're off on a different path. And you have really put the whole process that you set up at risk at that point. So.
Okay, one more. We'll take one more question. I see Mark.
I was going to say that this factor related to most often with contracts and RFPs is the composition of the especially getting into the recycling process. What's the state of the art now on finding and boxing different risk for what's going to happen to
Well, I'll take a first stab at this response, and maybe Peter will chime in again. What we're finding, certainly, I think now, is that we used to put all that risk on the contractor's shoulders, as well as the risk related to recycling revenues and fluctuations. And with the change in the recycling markets, as well as with the changes that are occurring through the high diversion and zero waste programs and plans that are coming into play, we're starting to see people rethinking that. And I think the reality is that there's no sort of perfect fix or perfect solution that's been developed at this point, but what I do see is that there seems to be more introduction of waste characterizations being included periodically into the contract to check and study the composition of the materials and potentially alter, say, the recycling fee payments or make adjustments related to that, where we have not done that in the past.
Okay. I see Peter would really
Peter?
like to make a...
Do you have ways of trying to balance what might be an advantage that the incumbent has? An incumbent may have an advantage because of facilities, for example. And are there any ways to structure the procurement process in town? And there's probably a one-off situation where you can, in some way, try to even the playing field even a little bit, because you can't necessarily be in every situation. But do you have any stories to tell about that?
Yes. Thank you, Deborah, for prompting me. So the question is, are there strategies that you can use in an RFP process to level the playing field for the proposers, because typically an incumbent might have an advantage? There's a couple things that come to mind. Certainly, Peter talked about having good, accurate data, and the more data that you can provide to the proposers, the better those proposers will be in a position to respond. And some of that comes back to how you draft your franchise and your right to get good, detailed information on an ongoing basis, as well as cost data and operational statistics, so you can provide good information. The other thing that we often see is that we'll typically structure the base proposal around requiring new equipment and new vehicles so that everyone's on a level playing field, and we might invite or allow for an alternative that would come through with used equipment to kind of address that incumbent's issue. There's other strategies. Milpitas is an example. We attempted this in the CCCSWA, is to procure the disposal services or composting services separately in the event that there's one or two companies that are local, more logical solutions to have that, to bid that separately so you can contract for that and then contract for your collection services to put the collectors on more of an equal footing. Those are the three things that came to mind for me quickly. Okay.
I understand. Separating the services out and doing separate procurements can be a way to really increase your collection proposals, because some firms are vertically integrated. They do everything, and they want to do it all. They want to collect, they want to process, they want to dispose. Most parts of the state, there are some very good companies that really are just focused on collection, or maybe collection and processing, and they're not in really a position to propose if it's an all-in-one integrated package. They frequently aren't in that situation. So if you want to entertain those types of proposers, you want to set up a process that allows them to really compete. So,
yeah. Okay. Let's hear it. Let's give a hand to the team from HF&H. Excellent. An excellent proposal.